My little lecture here today is called L's and S's in the Land of Israel, Lateral Soundplay in the Hebrew Bible and its World. And what I will be talking to you about is how, in a very short sort of way, I'll talk about how you can use the study of historical linguistic wordplay in the analysis of text from the Hebrew Bible in order not just, to learn more about the Hebrew language and its history, but actually to understand text better and to understand why texts look the way they do. Because as many of you know, the authors of the Hebrew Bible loved their wordplay. They absolutely loved it. You see this even in an introductory course in biblical Hebrew, how much they love wordplay. But here, I'll not just talk about obvious wordplay, but also about wordplay which involves historical developments of sounds, and specifically wordplay that is only discernible if we take the historical developments of sounds into account. So without further ado, let us throw ourselves into the world of lateral fricatives. Okay, let's see here. There we are. You recognize these two? These two transcriptional symbols may be familiar to some of you, but not to some of you, perhaps. The left one is the one usually used to render the Hebrew letter sin, or sin. Sin is a weird letter, because in schoolbook Hebrew grammar, we learn that sin is just pronounced like an S, the very same way as the letter samech. And in, say, late Second Temple Hebrew, it certainly was. We know that because the letters interchanged. Both in Hebrew and Aramaic, you find misspellings between sin and samech. But it's weird to have two different letters to spell the same sound, a simple S. And indeed, for quite a long time in Semitic scholarship, it's been well known that originally the letter sin, which we find the transcription of to the left there, the S with an accent, the letter sin was not just an S. It was, in fact, a lateral fricative. And what is a lateral fricative? Well, a lateral is a sound that is pronounced with air flowing out at the side, the latus, of the tongue. The most common lateral fricative of all is L. In fact, that's the only one we have in Swedish or English. There is one language, a rather well-known language actually in Europe, that does have a lateral fricative, and that language is Welsh. You find the lateral fricative in the funny double L's of Welsh, the ll, which you can hear in wonderful place names such as Llandudno, the ll. Early Semitic languages had this sound, the ll. Early Hebrew had this sound, and that was originally the sound spelt with sin. And how do we know this? We know this because there are languages, Semitic languages today, which still preserve this sound. And the only Semitic languages that preserve them today are modern South Arabian, languages like Mehri and Soqotri, which are not dialects of Arabic, but minority languages in the southern Arabian Peninsula. But we also know that this sound was actually current even in Hebrew, or at least in Northwest Semitic, through certain loanwords ancient loanwords into other languages. The most famous one is the word balsamon, which means balm, as in B-A-L-M, Swedish balsam. Balsamon is a Greek word for this, and it was borrowed subsequently into Latin and thence to Swedish and English. And we know that this was a Semitic loan. And it appears the Hebrew word, Hebrew, or say, we don't know exactly what Semitic language is borrowed from. It's probably Hebrew or Phoenician. In Hebrew, the word appears as bosem, with a sin. Bosem means something like fragrance. Appears in Song of Songs, I think. But look at how Greek renders this word. The sin, the S there, is an ls. It's an L and an S after each other, which shows that the sound which was spoken back in the day, in the current Hebrew or Phoenician of the times, was not a simple S. It was something which to a Greek ear sounded like a cross between an L and an S, which fits exactly with what we know from modern South Arabian about this sound, that it was a lateral fricative. And here we go. And here again we have the two transcriptional symbols, and below them we have their rendering into the International Phonetic Alphabet. The left one there, the L with a little bow or hook, that is the h sound. So that's just to show how this was probably pronounced before it started just being pronounced S, as we know it from Hebrew school grammar. The other one, the S with an accent and a dot. That's an even weirder sound from a Hebrew perspective, because in Hebrew this sound was normally lost. This is the emphatic correlate of the sh. You know, as you know, in many Semitic languages, there's an emphatic and a non-emphatic variant of a sound. In Hebrew, we have in the T series, we have tau and tet, for example, and we have kaf and kof. And in early Semitic, there were two lateral fricatives. There was a sh and there was a k. Yeah, say that 3 times in a row. And something like k. And we know this sound existed. It has direct descendants, for example, in Arabic today, where it turned into a b, and in Aramaic it turned into a kof or a ayin, which is rather weird. So what I'll be talking to today is cases in which these two weird sounds, the sh and the k, which were apparently there in early Semitic, can prove keys to understanding why certain biblical passages look the way they do. And I'll just give a few examples, obviously, because of lack of time. I said L's and S's in the land of Israel. Let's just look first. We'll return to this at the end. Let's just look at the phrase Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. That's how we learn in Hebrew school grammar to pronounce this, Eretz Yisrael. But the first thing we can note there is that the word Yisrael has a sin in it. So historically, it was something like Yisrael. That's number one. Then look at the Eretz part, the land. If we look at the cognate of that word in Arabic, in Aramaic, we see that the word originally did not just have a tzadeh, but the emphatic lateral fricative, the weird thing. We see that because the word appears, the word earth, appears in Arabic as ard, with the, and in Aramaic as arqa and ar'a, not as artsa, ar'a. All this shows us that originally it was arq. So this expression, which is perhaps not that common in the Hebrew Bible, but at least very, very common in subsequent Jewish history, was originally not just Eretz Yisrael. It had at least one and possibly two lateral fricatives in it. Just keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. That was just sort of setting the stage. The first example we'll look at is actually from Aramaic. It's one of the few verses in the Hebrew Bible that are not in Hebrew, namely Jeremiah 10, verse 11, which says this: Hidna temerun lehom elahaya dishmaya wa arqa la'avadu yevadu me ar'a umin tahot shemaya eleh. Now you shall say to them, the gods that did not make the heavens and the earth, they shall perish from the earth, and the same from beneath the heavens. There are many interesting things to discuss in this verse. The first one is, of course, why is it in Aramaic? It's just that one verse. And the second thing is, it's not, even the Aramaic is weird, because this earth word appears in two forms. First, we have in one line, arqa, and then in the second line, we have ar'a, if you see it. Both means the earth, both mean the earth. And we know from our other Aramaic sources that there was once a sort of historical change in how this old lateral was pronounced in Aramaic. First, it was written with a kof, then it was written with an ayin, but here we find both in the same verse. So it appears as though there's a historical development of this sound going on in the verse itself. As I mentioned, modern South Arabian are the only Semitic languages that actually keep these the lateral fricatives as the sounds they originally were. This shows that these are perhaps the most unstable sounds that the Semitic languages possessed. They were the weirdest, most prone to disintegration sounds that the Semitic languages possessed. And what do we have here in this verse? What we have is a beautiful sort of phonetic assonance. We have words that seem to almost to rhyme with each other. We have Elahaya, the gods, and Elle, these. We have Shemaya, the heavens, and Tahot Shemaya, beneath the heavens. We have Arqa and Ar'a, the two historical versions of the earth word in the two lines that sort of echo each other. And then finally we have Avadu, they made, and Yevadu, they may they perish, they will perish. So what the author here appears to have done is to use consciously in the two parallel lines words that sound similar but mean different things, or perhaps mean, or if they mean the same thing, he or she has varied the sound. And how has he or she done this? By using the two different reflexes of the lateral fricative, the kof in arqa and the ayn in ar'a. And this is something really, really special going on here, because this demands that the author not only know that the sound was changing, perhaps in different, the change had gone differently in different dialects. The author had to know that, and then the author used that creatively for poetic purposes. And that is something quite impressive right there. So I argue that this is not just, the sound fluctuating. I mean, sure, it was fluctuating, but the author used the fact that it was fluctuating as a poetic point. We find something similar in the Ugaritic Baal cycle, where the word for darkness, Rulmatu or Thulmatu, appear in two alternating lines, two different developments of the same word appearing in that way. We have also something similar in the famous Shibboleth story, where the pronunciation of sh was apparently used to separate people into groups. But this shows that this sort of play, using different historical development, different historical stages of sounds for poetic purposes, was part of the toolbox of Northwest Semitic poetic diction. And this is something quite advanced. This is something quite advanced, not only to notice that this is happening, but to use it creatively. How often do you find English or Swedish poets do that? I mean, it does happen, but it's remarkably advanced. And it shows something else as well. It shows that for this to work, the verse had to be in Aramaic, because Hebrew doesn't develop the sounds like that. In Hebrew, as I mentioned, the emphatic lateral fricative, the word k, normally turns up as a tzadeh. That's why it's aretz or eretz in Hebrew. So one, the technique seems to have been very conscious, knowing the historical reflexes. Two, the passage has to be in Aramaic. It's not just, an Aramaic gloss or something, as is sometimes argued, but it has to be in Aramaic for the poetry to work. And it uses historical linguistics as a sort of rhyming tool. This is something you could never get across in translation, I can tell you. Moving on. Another example we find in Isaiah 1, verse 14, where Yahweh complains about sacrifices. Your moon feasts and seasonal gatherings, my nefesh, myself, hates. They have for me become a burden. I am too tired to bear them. Nil'eti neso. I am too tired to bear them. Jag orkar ej bära dem mer. It would be in Swedish, because Swedish has the wonderful word orka, to not have the strength to. And that's the words that we're focusing on here. The final two words, nil eti neso. Look at it. First we have nil eti, I am too tired out. What's the structure of that word? First we have the n, a nun. Then we have a lateral sound, the most common lateral sound, the L, the lamed, nil. Then we have an aleph, n, l, e. And the second word starts with an N. Then we have a sin, which originally was a lateral, a hl. And then we have an aleph, nil eti nesho, nil eti nesho. Do you hear it? You hear it? And this is a type of wordplay using this repeated phonological structure, N lateral aleph, N lateral aleph. You can only see this if you reckon with the fact that at the time this was written, the scene would probably have been a sheen. Unless you know this wordplay just passes you by, which is quite cool. And that in itself is an argument for learning not just a modern school pronunciation, or for that matter, a medieval Tiberian pronunciation, which is cool in and of itself. The pun is only visible, or rather audible, when one is aware of the historical pronunciation of the scene. And this brings us back to the land of Israel itself. I said L's and S's in the land of Israel, and I meant that quite literally. Not just that they existed in the land of Israel, but they existed in the expression, the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael. This isn't a very common expression in the Hebrew Bible. It appears a couple of times. It appears in Ezekiel, for example, on 2 occasions, I think, describing the ideal land of the returnees. But as you know, after the exile, already before the exile, but especially after, Yehudites or Judahites started appropriating the term Israel for themselves. Israel, of course, originally being a term for the northern kingdom or its area. But then in the southern kingdom, people from historically the southern kingdom started calling themselves Israel, which is, of course, very weird. And it's been discussed by Philip Davies and other people. Why did this happen? It's a bit like as if a lot of Swedes were deported to Finland for a generation, went back and started calling themselves Danes. It's really strange. It's really, really strange. And there have been lots of arguments put forward about how this happened. Why did the Judahites start referring to themselves as Israel? People have discussed the role of the tribe of Benjamin, etc., etc., and all that may quite well be true. But I here put forth a modest proposal that maybe there was a literary aspect to this, because the expression Eretz Yisrael really sounds good. And it sounds even better if you look at it with lateral glasses. Because what have we got here? First, we have the Eretz word, which historically has the old lateral in it, as we saw in the case of the Aramaic and the Arabic examples. We have historically, we don't know, normally that sound disappeared in Hebrew, but it has been suggested by, for example, Tanya Notarius and Richard Steiner that it may have persisted dialectally into Hebrew, spelt still with tzadeh, but maybe there in speech. And then we have Yisrael. And what is that? First we have a y, then we have a lateral fricative again, a sh, a sin, and then we have a resh again, and then we have an aleph. And then we have actually another lateral. But first we have aleph, resh, lateral. Then in the other word, we have lateral, resh, aleph, Erek Yisrael. They're almost inverses of each other, which means that they would have worked extremely well in, say, demagogical speeches, in addressing a large crowd of people, because it just sounds good. Erek Yisrael, Erek Yisrael. The two words are sort of inversions of each other. And that I humbly suggest maybe have been an added reason for the increasing commonality of this term. It starts appearing in a couple of places in the Deuteronomistic history, a couple of places in Chronicles and in Ezekiel, but then in later Jewish literature, it becomes very important, and of course still is. And maybe the sound played a part in that. And that's, if true, is a fascinating proposal. because it then would show, or at least suggest, that not only can these word plays be interesting as a sort of additional fun thing for the biblical specialist, which they are, they certainly are, but they may actually have influenced the socio-linguistic developments and theological history of the idea of the land of Israel. Speculative, I grant you, but but I also think it's a very interesting possibility. And when you just look at it, it almost jumps out at you. Aleph, resh, lateral. Lateral, resh, aleph. Erik, Yisrael. It's almost similar to, the famous beginning words of the Hebrew Bible, Bereshith bara, where it's Beth Resh Aleph, which is certainly not a coincidence. There it's not a lateral, but it's something similar. The sounds and the sequence of the sounds almost rhyming. So if there was a literary construct, this would have worked really, really well. And the L's and S's were not just part of the poetry of the land of Israel, they were part of the land, may have been part of the land of Israel as such. And just to end, because we have at least one Indo-Europeanist here, as some of you know, I've done some work, this will be quick. I've done some work on Indo-European influences on the world of the Hebrew Bible. And one of the things I studied there was both Indo-European languages and the languages of the world of the Hebrew Bible, the Semitic languages there, talk about a god slaying a big, dangerous dragon. A very famous Indo-Europeanist called Calvert Watkins reconstructed an Indo-European phrase meaning he slew the dragon, and he reconstructed it as Egwent Ogwim. You don't have to know why he did that, but he did. Or Egwent Ogwim, you can also write it as. And in my work there, I thought if that was borrowed from the Indo-Europeans, could the early Northwest Semites have had a similar phrase that sounded similarly cool? Because the Egwent Ogwim uses a very rare sound. Gw is a very rare sound in early Indo-European. And I reconstructed a phrase meaning he killed the snake based on phrases in Hebrew and Ugaritic, which we find in the Hebrew Bible and in the Baal cycle. And I reconstructed Machatza Nahasha. He killed the snake. He killed the serpent. But I've only later realized that the word Machatza, which in Hebrew is machatz, to strike, originally had a lateral fricative in it. So it was originally machatza. So if this reconstruction is true, if I was right there, it means that they actually didn't just translate the phrase, they translated the idea of using one of the most unusual sounds of the language. They heard an unusual sound and they used their own weird, marked, unstable sound, the which would in a way be a sort of weird, separate sign that the reconstruction may be correct. But this is much earlier than the time of the Hebrew Bible. This would have been in Proto-Northwest Semitic, so this would have been in the second millennium. But anyway, all of these examples show how knowing this historical pronunciation of the shin and the perhaps sometimes ta'ade can aid us not just in reading the Bible more historically correct, but actually understanding why it looks the way it does. Why did the Jeremiah author suddenly use Aramaic? Why does the Isaiah author use this beautiful I cannot bear it anymore phrase? And maybe even why did the term the land of Israel sound so nice and become so popular later on? And here we have a little bibliography. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.